Happy Thursday, boys and girls. Welcome to Stir Crazy episode number 59. We are calling this one The Time Has Come to Rage, and rage we shall. I'm your host, Kim Brown. Coming up on today's program, gang, we're going to do a quick recap of the pretty stunning night that happened on Tuesday in a slew of Democratic primaries nationwide. Progressive candidates put the stomping down on some of those establishment incumbents. It was a glorious thing to see. Now, is this going to result in more progressives being elected to Congress? How will this impact November? We're going to have a discussion about that. Also, the protests are still very much going strong in your city, nationwide. People are still taken to the streets by the hundreds. And this is every single day, guys. This protest momentum has been sustained, and I don't think it's going to slow down anytime soon. And in response, from at least a legislative perspective, Congress acts like they are trying to take some moves on police reform. It's kind of stupid though, because the Democrats are proposing weak shit, the Republicans are proposing weak shit, and both of them are like, we don't agree with you, even though it's the Spider-Man meme where they are pointing at each other with terrible proposals. We shall break them down. Also, when it comes to policing, gang, there have been a number of studies on some individual cities where defunding the police or disbanding the police have been proposed and executed in one form or another. We've already talked about Camden. There's another town in New Jersey that has attempted this as well. And the Washington Post, well, the San Francisco Gate, sfgate.com, anyway, but they had a really good article about Vallejo, California, how back when the financial crisis of 2008 happened, they had a huge hole in their budget and they had to cut their police force dramatically. Well, what happened was police shootings skyrocketed. We're going to discuss what happens when the police lose their money. Do they freak the fuck out? Sometimes they absolutely do. Now, listen, of course, we always want to hear from you, our fantastic viewers, our commentators, our chatters. Get at us in the chat, in the comments. We missed you guys past couple of days. It's been a little light around these Stir Crazy parts. But right now, it's time to bring in our great, fantastic panel. As always, we have a collection of the industry's best and brightest voices and perspectives to bring to you here on The Real News. Starting off with our own Andrew Corkery. He's our visuals and research producer. He's joining us today from Baltimore. Also joined today with Marcus Ferrell, political consultant. We have two consultants on the show today. Adriel Hampton is also joining us. And a little later on the show, we're going to speak with a political director from SEIU 1199 from Maryland and DC. Ricarra Jones is going to be here to discuss how Maryland's minimum wage is still moving forward, despite the fact that it's getting a lot of opposition from business leaders. But this is something that the state agreed to push this minimum wage up by 2020. So we're going to have a talk with her about how that's going. But in the interim, gentlemen, thank you all for being here. I feel like Gladys Knight and the Pips.
Shoo-doo, shoo-doo.
That's cool. I'll stick being Gladys. Y'all can work out the steps behind me. Gentlemen, but let's start off with Tuesday and how big of a deal it was to see progressives take out some of these establishment Democrats in some pretty significant races. Of course, New York City being the big one, where we saw Jamal Bowman take out longtime incumbent Eliot Engel. Also, Cara Jones was victorious over a departing incumbent. I can't recall her name, Nina Lowry, I think it was. And in Kentucky, I think we have not received the official count yet. But Dwayne, if we could pop up that tweet from Mr. Charles Booker, the Kentucky state senator, the progressive, who posed a hell of a challenge to Amy McGrath, the person who hoped to achieve the Democratic nomination against to face Mitch McConnell in the fall. Let's look at this. So this is what Charles Booker is saying. This was earlier this afternoon. He said the numbers are coming in, and it appears as though he does have a narrow lead over Amy McGrath, maybe to the tune of less than 3,000 votes. So this is an interesting race, still not decided yet, still counting. But let's look real quick, Dwayne, if we could, at the video of the people who are banging on the windows in Kentucky to try to let us in to come and vote. Of course, if there's a vote involving Black folks, there is going to be some oppression and suppression in the works. So many polling places in Kentucky were closed in advance of Tuesday's primary. People were being funneled to the big expo center in downtown Louisville. Do we have that video? Yeah, let's listen to that, Dwayne, because people were beating shit out the window. Let's hear it. Okay, so that was Tuesday morning. Come Tuesday evening, however, there was a little bit of drama coming out of Kentucky where the polls were closed at 6. There was an injunction filed on behalf of the Booker campaign to reopen the polls, so people who were in line were able to come and vote. Very significant. But even though we don't know the outcome of that particular race, Marcus Ferrell, let's talk about what happened, what did happen, the races that we do know the outcomes of, where Jamal Bowman just ran a stunning campaign over Elliot Engel. What are your thoughts?
This is the Democratic Party's skirt has been shown. Their underwear has been shown. They had the all of the issues. You got to understand, this is one of the first primaries where all of the issues that the base of the Democratic Party has been ignoring. I mean, has wanted, but the establishment class has been ignoring. It's the first time that it has come to pass after all of the reckoning of the events. We talk about COVID-19 and people getting sick, then you have to start talking about Medicare for all and how there was an extreme amount of pushback just to make sure that Americans get health care. When you're talking about the racial justice issues of America and how they've been unresolved from people like Elliot Engel, who literally said during the campaign that if Black Lives Matter wasn't the issue, he wouldn't even be talking about it, he wouldn't even be speaking. So what's happening is that voters are showing the dirty underbelly of the Democratic Party that is no longer acceptable to avoid issues. And I think the most important thing that we're seeing from these races, and we're going to continue to see them, is that the establishment figures that have so long wanted to just talk about corporations and how they can just be a softer version, basically, of the Republican Party, they're being exposed for what they are. And what I find the most exciting about this moment is it's not going to stop. People are like, as we look at this, COVID-19 ain't going away because there's an idiot as the president, and these states aren't shutting down. And there's a soft ass bill when it comes down to police reform. And don't get me wrong, I'm happy about any bill that comes down to police reform, but it's not defunding the police, and it's soft, and the measures they're pushing are soft. And what's going to end up happening is Black people are still going to get killed even after this bill is handled. So unfortunately, next month, when the next Black person dies because nothing has happened yet, then guess what? We're going to have more reasons to stay on the street and protest. So we're going to see a lot of this going forward in the future.
Adriel, before I go to you, I wanted to play a clip from Jamal Bowman's victory speech Tuesday night in New York City. Let's have a listen.
Unfortunately, as we all know, we live in a country where, despite our financial wealth, we have tens of millions of children still living in poverty. And as an educator working for the Department of Education for 20 years, I've seen the impact of poverty on the lives of our kids each and every day. And poverty is not a result of children and families who don't work hard. Our children and families work as hard as anyone else. Poverty is by political design, and it's rooted in a system that has been fractured and corrupt and rotten from its core from the inception of America, especially over the last several decades. So poverty and the impact of poverty on our children and dealing with issues of institutional racism and sexism and classism and xenophobia and everything that keeps the majority of us oppressed is what we designed this campaign to fight against. So tonight, as we celebrate, we don't just celebrate me as an individual. We celebrate this movement, a movement designed to push back against a system that's literally killing us. It's killing Black and brown bodies disproportionately, but it's killing all of us. It's killing us mentally, psychologically, and spiritually. It's forcing us to live in a country and in a world where so many people are hopeless and have lost faith, not just in the political system, but in each other. But our movement is designed to restore that faith, to restore that hope, to bring back the belief in what is possible, to root our values in everything we do, values of humanity, equality, and justice, values that will center us fighting for those who are disenfranchised.
Now, Adriel, listening to that speech, it is no surprise nor shock why the establishment Democrats were rallying against Jamal Bowman, why he was even, his opponent, Eliot Engel, was even receiving PAC money from conservatives. They don't want anybody in Congress talking about poverty as a political design and it's killing us all. Woo! Pretty exciting coming out of New York City for Jamal Bowman.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's when you listen to that whole speech, you actually think this is someone who's primarying an incumbent. You don't think this is someone who just won. We've seen these values represented, but I think the amazing thing is seeing them win, right? And I give a lot of credit, to things like Justice Democrats, which have been working to create the infrastructure for people like Jamal Bowman to jump in and actually beat an incumbent, who's raising millions of dollars. And I think, what Marcus said is what we're seeing kind of across the board, on Tuesday, and I think heading into upcoming elections as well. There's factors that are waking people up. Like, it's not just that people have their cell phones turned on looking at the cops. They have their cell phones turned on looking at the politicians. And now we're really seeing how many of these folks who are supposedly progressive or great legislators or have done a lot for us, how they have feet of clay when it comes to dealing with the COVID-19 crisis and dealing with the police brutality crisis. And, I think if you've been a progressive for a long time, and it's also incredible because we haven't seen Black leaders in the media like this since the Black Panther, since the 60s. So that's just a huge shift that we're seeing. And radical Black leaders, not people who are still indebted to the corporations, playing the game of I'll get mine and we'll have, as soon to be Rep. Bowman said, tens of millions of children in poverty.
Andrew, what was your big takeaway? Sorry, from Tuesday.
No, it's okay. I was just going to say that I think that we're beginning to see the cracks in the industry and codification of what has become the industry of neoliberal hand-wringing when it comes to dealing with systemic crises in society and not addressing them in a fundamental way that actually helps people's lives. And so, people like Jamal Bowman are really reaching into the rhetoric of Martin Luther King's, revolution of values, in which you connect systemic racism and the oppression of minority people in this country, particularly African Americans, to the class struggle, and you link them together as inextricably linked, so that people can begin to see exactly what Marcus is talking about, which is the underbelly of the neoliberal democratic professional class. And so once that gets shown through the instances that we've experienced here over this last year, through COVID, through mass, insurrection in our society, it no longer becomes hidden because it's affecting people who are traditionally outside of the class subsect that's affected most disproportionately by these issues. So when you have 44 million people who are unemployed, you begin to realize that the system itself needs to be questioned and not just the peripheral issues that you think is affecting your own livelihood.
I got to ask the consultants here, guys, looking at this these races, kind of giving a post-mortem of what worked and what didn't work for both the losers and the winners. Help us deconstruct exactly, in y'all's opinion, what you think propelled some of these candidates to victory, or perhaps potential victory in the case of Mr. Booker there in Kentucky. That race not yet decided, but damn, he's given Amy McGrath a run for her money all the way to the finish line. But at the same time, as Andrew pointed out, we have seen some failures from the traditional political and donor class. For example, we know Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, backed Eliot Engel. So did the Congressional Black Caucus's Political Action Committee, which is hilarious to me to even think about, and let alone say it out loud. But how did we achieve victory, gentlemen, in these specific races? And what do we need to do in order to replicate that many times over, not only to gain a Democratic majority in Congress, but a progressive majority amongst the Democrats?
I'll start by saying, it's interesting that if you go to the CBC PACs website, one of the first statements on their page is, "We are here to elect more Black people to Congress." That's the first thing. The second thing is, I'm gonna let, because I'm pretty sure Brother Adriel has more technical things than I'm going to say. I'm going to go more ethos. Okay, the reason why these progressives are winning is because it's one of the first times that you've seen Black candidates elevated at a high level that had finalized decision prowess over what their budget was going to be. That is that simple. A lot of campaigns, unfortunately, a lot of white progressives don't know how to skew the line between talking to people of color and also turning out the white progressive base. And there's not many people who have Black campaign managers or Black candidates or Black and brown folks who, as African Americans, we know how to make a dollar stretch, right? Jamal Bowman, he talked about his poverty growing up, and I'm sure he has an understanding of how to make $20 last him a whole week. And that's how we approach campaigns. And that's how we also approach fighting campaigns, and also being unapologetic about our messaging. What happens with Black candidates and Black campaign managers, and I'm not just trying to say me, but just in general, is that we have a unique understanding that there are certain talking points that white campaigns just don't want to talk about, that we're more than willing to say it. Now, in previous years past, I will also add that those talking points might have seemed a little bit outlandish. Medicare for all, reform and defund the police, that's crazy talk. And this is coming from progressives. Now that it's out in the open, and without me saying I told you so, I told you so. We've been saying the same thing for years, but now society sort of caught up with us. So that's what I think is happening, is that America finally understands that Black issues are just as American issues as anything else. And one of the ways that you can solve America's problems is if you start dealing with indigenous and Black problems, you'll see a better America for everybody.
Yeah, I just think, to add on to that real quick, the corporate Democrats' game and the Republicans' game is to basically create a fear machine in which you understand the world you live in to be, that could be worse than what it actually is in the moment in which you're living. So one of the things they do is they gin up this fear machine to try to create this near dystopian reality that is actually worse than, what you're living right now. But the problem is so many people are living such a worse reality than they would have, say, 10, 20 years ago, because of economic neoliberalization, because of systemic racism in our society, because of all these issues, that dystopian reality that they try to create a picture of that's not really reality it's untenable. You can't actually sell that, because the lives that people are living under COVID, where there's 44 million people who are unemployed, and we're constantly seeing Black people killed on the streets by agents of the state, people aren't scared of what could be. They're scared of what currently is. So you need to change what currently is. And so with that messaging in mind, Bowman and other people are really taking that to its end logical conclusion that we can kind of all be in this together and connect these issues to one another.
Adriel,
Do we have
hop in
time for
there.
one more?
Look,
Yeah.
oh, yes. Tell us, how did we
So-
achieve victory? How do we continue to achieve these victories? And speaking of which, Nancy Pelosi is facing a progressive challenge in her congressional district. What do you think about Brother Shahid's chances? Lots of questions in a row.
Well,
Sorry about that.
I helped launch that campaign, and I think that one thing, he has two things really going for him. One is he's an interesting, genuine progressive with a history of doing work in the movement. And then also, he is able to raise money nationally like few candidates can because it's against Pelosi. But I think that's what's showing our success is what Marcus said about having black candidates, black campaign managers, like not having it all be white progressives. I think that there's a pretty large group, multi-generational, of white progressives. And what we're seeing now is they're ready to work with a rainbow coalition led by non-white candidates and leaders. And I think for Shahid, it's like San Francisco is a place of a lot of entrenched wealth and white power. And, you look at the history with like the police rioted there because they thought that the gay men were getting off too easy, and they got Dan White, like killed the mayor. So San Francisco is a really interesting, troubled town. And what is it gonna take to get people to say, you know what, our median income is lower than most cities in California, most prosperous cities, even though there's more billionaires here than I think it's the first or second in the world. So I'm really interested in that campaign, and I know that the fundraising base is there to make it a battle. The thing is that electorate, too tied into the existing system, or are there enough folks who can, coalesce around Shahid?
We've got some comments from the comments. Red says, I've come to see police murdering of Black people as political executions. That's definitely one way to look at it. Also, people watching live on Periscope via Twitter, how y'all doing? Mandy DeVille says, Dems spend all of their time saying nice things, but voting like Republicans. Well, let's hope that those days are coming to an end, Mandy. And speaking of, part of the reason why we're even seeing any political movement on progressive fronts has everything to do with the fact that people have been in the streets for weeks now since the murder of George Floyd, and others, unfortunately, have also been killed by police since Mr. Floyd lost his life. But let's take a look at some of the protests. Let's start in New York. This is actually a photo of hundreds of people occupying City Hall Plaza, where folks have been protesting in New York pretty constantly for, like I said, a number of weeks, all the way from Brooklyn at the Barclays Center out to the Bronx. Let's get a look at that tweet, if we could, of the folks occupying City Hall, and it's in front of a sign that says "Defend Black Lives." So we also, like I said, we have pictures coming from New York. We have a lot of protests, like I said, happening everywhere across the country: Chicago, Philadelphia, New York City, LA, still very much out in the streets, DC, where we have seen the takedown of a Confederate statue. I think his name was Victor Pike, where protesters toppled that statue on Sunday. And actually, so let's now we're looking at that picture in New York. This is by the activist Tati, a tweet from a couple days ago, hashtag defund the police. We are outside Mayor de Blasio. Look at all them people, hundreds of folks occupying the stairs of City Hall. And let's take a look now. Let's go to Philly. Philly kept it all the way live with the protests. This video courtesy of Unicorn Riot. We love citizen activist journalists out there getting a lot of pictures, getting takes from people directly on the ground. Yes, let's take a look at Philly. Let's hear it too. Yeah, that looked to be right around Philly's Center City area, right around City Hall. Shout out to Philly doing it big. Something interesting happening in Chicago, however, where protesters faced off with a line of police. Now, what's interesting about this video that you're about to see a peaceful protest really shouting things at the cops, the cops standing there dealing with it. But the protest took things a step further. They started looking up specific police by name and calling out whether or not they had complaints filed against them. Let's listen.
12 use of force reports and 46 allegations against
Now, in case you didn't get a chance to read the tweet, just to put what you just saw in context, the person who was on the megaphone was calling out, again, some of the officers present at that specific scene by name and letting them know how many complaints they had filed against them that they were able to search online, which I thought was hilarious. Did we have another one? Oh, also, coming out of St. Louis, we all know Ferguson was very much a flashpoint for uprising several years ago after the murder of Mike Brown. And those protests are still ongoing outside of St. Louis in the areas near Ferguson, a town called Florissant, Missouri. This video we're about to see are protesters staging a die-in right there on Lindbergh Boulevard, 314. You know what we're talking about, right there in St. Louis. Lindbergh by the Quick Trip is what the reporter said. And you'll see people out there shutting down traffic. Let's take a look at that. Honoring a moment of silence there. Panel, this is unprecedented, really, in certainly in all of our lifetimes. We have not seen anything this sustained, this ongoing, and really seem to be kicking some ass early on, making some policy changes, albeit at the very basic levels to begin with. But, hopefully these policy changes will continue to move up the ladder and get, gain more and more strength. I wanted to get y'all's take about what you have been witnessing, especially in your respective cities and towns. Marcus, I'm going to start with you because we know Atlanta was just on fire recently with the murder of Rayshard Brooks, and he has been laid to rest, I believe, this week. His funeral was. But talk to us about what the tenor is in Atlanta right now.
Well, first, I want to say these are streets. Fuck the police. These are streets. Look, first, you said a couple things. I wanted to just address one thing. CPD, seriously, fuck those guys. They need reform and defunding like crazy. I want everybody in the world to look up John Birch and torture. I also want to make sure that everybody also looks up, if you don't know, let's not ever forget about Laquan McDonald, Rahm Emanuel, 16 shots in the cover-up. Those guys are notorious for hurting the community members. Secondly, you said something about statues, and I want to just make this point before I get to Atlanta, and then I'll be done. The statue issue in America is important. They, as I said on Twitter, they're like stone nooses that are hanging in the park. But give me reparations and keep the statues up. I could care less about statues. Just make sure the police don't kill me. That's my personal view. Make sure the police don't kill me and give me reparations, and I'll be fine with them. In Atlanta, there was nothing better than seeing white, black, Puerto Rican, brown, Native people come together and block traffic on Boulevard and John Lewis Freedom Parkway. We stopped the traffic. So the tenor is still there. People got to work. So every day there's multiple actions that people take, and everyone is still showing up, right? So this is not going to go away. And I hope these lawmakers actually come up with some tangible plans, because if they don't, the protests will never stop. And this will be a forever purgatory type protest against them and their actions.
Adriel, I know you're out in, I don't know what part of California you're joining us from, but I know Cali is live from the Redwood Forest down to the San Diego Bay. What's happening?
Yeah, I'm down in Southern California. I live in a smaller suburban town called Carlsbad, and here the nature of the decentralized nature of the people putting together these events. Carlsbad had a locally led, like basically I think high schoolers or maybe college students, and it was 3 days long, several hours. It was a big march down the coast, and so it was like, you're seeing the waves in the background. It's very different than the New York or Chicago photos. And then doing a small vigil for George Floyd and walking back, and then having ongoing protest in the downtown, which is a very touristy downtown. The crazy thing here is we did have like somebody saying they're assembling a gun squad, and it became a big news event and viral on Twitter. Because the guy was saying they were gonna, try to shoot protesters if they broke windows, and so that was earlier. Los Angeles is very much like how Marcus describes Atlanta, with multiple events a day, and you're seeing a lot of people on Instagram, basically making stories that have the list of events, and they're in different locations because LA is so big. But you've also seen just these huge, iconic drone footage of tens of thousands of people. And I think that that point about it being something that where you can take 2 hours out of your day when you still have to work, plus you have tens of millions of people unemployed right now, and you have other people who are at home with more flexible schedules, and it will go on for a long, long time. COVID is not going away. In fact, it's getting worse in California, and people are not going to stop. And Marcus is absolutely right. If the elected officials don't have an answer, they're going to end up getting thrown out. And some of them, it won't be elections; it'll be people pressuring them out of office. So it's kind of a big time for change here in this next few months.
Andrew,
Yeah.
what have been your observations? Go ahead, babe.
Yeah, so I mean, like, I haven't been out on the streets personally myself, but like, I'm from Philly, and from South Jersey, so I just want to say, big ups to my man Gritty out there protesting. I don't know if you saw him in the Gritty suit in the video.
He's looking good.
Gritty is a mascot for the Flyers, and has kind of been co-opted by a lot of people on the left to kind of represent anti-establishment, more left-wing views and so forth. But yeah, I would say that Philly is kind of a microcosm of what's going on in the country right now, because there's a lot of intersectionality in Philly between class issues and race issues, a lot of history of redlining, and you also have this whole issue with, Philly being a Democratic-run city, but being a Democratic-run city in the context of, the neoliberal corporate wing of the Democratic Party, which is currently, in upheaval to a certain extent due to a lot of these progressive movements in the country who are looking for actual systemic change and real policies to be delivered on. So I think that there's a confluence of things going on in Philly, but I mean, there's actions every single day. I get messages from friends and, DSA and other groups, Democratic Socialists of America, that are protesting, taking to the streets in Philly. But there's also a very vigorous backlash in Philly too, which hasn't been quite as omnipresent in other cities, because of the fact that there is this really entrenched, town/white working class contingent of Philly politics and Philly culture, in which there are elements of that are overtly racist and are pushing back against that. And you've seen that as emblematic in what happened with the Columbus statue in some of the areas in South Philly. You've seen that as it relates to Fishtown, and some of the people who've lived in Fishtown for 30, or 40 years before gentrification, who are white, who are working class, who do harbor, racist and or really problematic views, coming to the streets. And one of them, a group of people who are like, white supremacist vigilantes, people from the town and some people from outside, they beat a reporter and from the PBS affiliate in Philadelphia a couple weeks ago. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff going on there, but I think it's emblematic of what's going on in the whole country. But I do think that this is not going to go away, because there's just no tangible reason for it to go away, because the structural problems haven't been solved and millions of people are unemployed. So, the revolution continues.
Guys, I want to address the reasons, obviously, why people are in the streets, and that is the issue of lack of police accountability and police brutality and murder against Black and brown folks and gay and trans bodies out there in the United States. And I want to go to a story coming out of North Carolina. This is out of Wilmington, North Carolina, where 3 police officers from the Wilmington, North Carolina Police Department have been fired recently. Why? Because they were racist as shit. And how do we know that they were racist as shit? Well, because their police department routinely does video audits. So a person, an employee of the police department will go through the video footage recorded in their cars and via their body cams, just as a routine review. And during one of these audits, 2 officers, at least one, I should say, Officer Piner and Gilmore, they begin talking from their respective cars. I'm quoting here from the Charlotte Observer. Officer Piner is quoted as saying that the police department was, quote, kneeling down with the Black folks. He then referred to a Black female as a Negro and then referred to a Black magistrate as a racial slur, not once but twice. And another police officer, Officer Moore, used a gay slur to describe the magistrate as well. But later on, it got better. Piner told Moore, quoting from the Charlotte Observer again, that he feels a civil war is coming and that he is ready. Piner said he was going to buy a new assault rifle and soon, quote, we are just going to go out and start slaughtering those fucking Blacks. I can't wait. God, I can't wait. Moore responded that he wouldn't do that. Okay, but Officer Piner said that he is 100% about that life. And he's also went on to say that he felt a civil war was needed to, quote, wipe them off the fucking map. That'll put them back about 4 or 5 generations, end quote. These are common attitudes, I would say. I can't give a percentage. I don't really know how many cops hold racist or violent views towards Black and brown people, but we know from a policy perspective that those attitudes are not necessarily frowned on. And it seems that now, because of the protests, because of the uprisings, because of all the momentum happening in the streets, there's actually now actions being taken by police on a human resources level that police departments are saying that, nope, we're not going for this. If we find this, we're going to get rid of this. But at the same time, police unions are very strong. We know that a lot of cops who have actually murdered people have gone on to eventually get their jobs back. So, Marcus, I feel like we're in the in-between time now where there is a reckoning happening. It's happening more so as a trickle rather than a waterfall. But what is your take about what these officers had to say and the response that the city took to fire them?
No shit, and I'm surprised. Look, there's a reason why every time I see a cop when I'm driving my car around town that I literally, my heart stops. If I just drive past one and I don't have nothing on me, right? We already know. I mean, there was an early in the 2000s, the FBI dropped a report saying that it was a highly likely that white supremacists were infiltrating local police departments and sheriff's departments across the country. You think that was a game? These guys, and the accountability portion comes basically after America gets shut down. American streets get shut down with protesters, right? Wilmington doesn't want no problems, and it's unfortunate that we had to do that for any kind of justice or any kind of self-check to even happen from these police departments. Listen, our protests are working. And the reason why I say that is because if you think about it, they act fast because there is a larger contingency than Republicans and moderates want to admit that are saying defund the police, right? Those people have to hear that. Some of these people are dependent upon their jobs. That human resources department, she probably has a Black son, or he probably has a Black son, Black daughter, might be anybody, might be a white person who just cares. But guess what? They are finally under the understanding that if we don't do something, if we don't say something, then this person is going to keep the job that I go to every day, make them look bad. So yeah, no shit. There's racist cops. I think we all know that. I mean, Reginald Finney. I mean, the LA riot started because of racist cops. But what's more important is that there's actually starting to be something that's done about it. I wish it was from more of a policy angle than it was from internal employees, but I'll take whatever we can get.
You know, what I found most encouraging about this story is that these officers were just fired on the spot. It wasn't we're going to send Officer Dickey and them back to some training. They just need some anti-bias training. They just need the racism trained out of them, as if that is a thing, as if that is something that is even possible. You know, Andrew, that's what kills me, I think, about some of these suggested police reforms, and especially when it comes to anti-bias training. Like, by the time you are on the police force, you're probably a person in your 20s or 30s. If you're racist, you're probably pretty cemented in your racism. And I don't know that 8-hour classes can defer you or change your thinking if you already hold white supremacist ideologies.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, Kim. And actually, if you look at The Guardian today, they did a story talking about the prevalent and how prevalent it was that white supremacists were infiltrating the military as well. And so if you look at this contingent of people that get drawn into the military and drawn into the police force, there is a sizable contingent of people that have this ideological viewpoint, a white supremacist, anti-black, destruction-based ideology, basically. And, this permeates every part of society. I don't think white people really realize that, but it's larger than people understand. And this is part of the problem with just, reforming the police in the wake of what happened, in 2014 and 2015 with Freddie Gray and Michael Brown and all this stuff. We've had 5 years to kind of let that reach its logical conclusion. And we still have a police department that is utterly infected with systemic racism, whether it's through the way that they recruit police officers or whether it's through the training that they have, or sometimes even the bias training doesn't even, register as real bias training. There's a whole cottage industry of people selling this idea, Kim, that you can just train away the racism, that it just goes away. And there's not institutional value sets placed upon the keeping of the institutional racism in the system. And so that's the problem, is you think that you can deal with the bad apples, this bad apples analogy that all these people on the right and sometimes people who are democratic centrists throw out. We're not talking about bad apples. We're talking about a proverbial orchard of police destruction and violence against black people and people of color in the society. So you have to create a whole new tree. You can't just rip apart a couple of these apples off the tree and say, okay, well, we're good, we're fine. That doesn't work anymore. And people are seeing this systemic racism on such a fast, accelerated point now, where it's just become completely unacceptable if you have any semblance of reality, about what's going on.
Adriel, I'm going to hit you with the hard question. But first, let me read you another quote from the piece in the Charlotte Observer. It says, according to police, the officers admitted that it was their voices on the video and didn't deny any of the content. While the officers denied that they were racist, I'm sorry. While the officers denied that they were racist, they blamed their comments on the stress on law enforcement in light of the protests over the death of George Floyd. Now, of course, how can they be racist if they just refer to black people as N-words a couple times, Adriel? That doesn't make people racist. But here's my question to you, though, because, we're talking about getting racists out of policing, but when did they ever have to leave policing? I'm thinking about Bull Connor during the period of civil rights, his police force openly attacking peaceful black protesters. I mean, to be racist was part of the job for a very long time. And I don't know at what point in our history did that ever cease being a thing up until now, where people are starting to put their foot down.
Right. I mean, I think this even goes back to the arguments about what it means, the right to keep and bear arms, right? And whether that is just another artifact of slavery, of needing to keep African Americans down in America. And I think when the police, I really like that analogy about the it's not the apples that are bad, it's the whole tree, right? And these officers trying to say they're not racist. It's like this stress just gave you an opportunity to say what you really believe. And what's changed is people's perception of, like, in LA, it's the budget is 54% of the city budget, their discretionary funds are for the police department. And it's like totally insane. Like, people are like of every, I think, class, and it's like, any semblance of an ethical framework of like wanting to live in a society. You're saying, why are we paying for this bullshit? And these cops are they tie their salaries to firefighters in the negotiations. And so they ride on the popularity of the firefighters, and the cops just make more money than just about anyone else. I used to work in city government, so this is like a very real one to me. I worked on police brutality lawsuit defense for the city. So I have a very intimate knowledge of, what happens when people sue because the cops beat them up during an arrest. And it's just, it's not rotten. It's the entire structure from slave catchers to police is meant to enforce white supremacy. It's meant to enforce the supremacy of capital. And, I'm with Marcus, I think that reparations are in order for indigenous people and for the descendants of slaves, because this is, it's a system that until you kind of flip it, it's never going to be right. You're just going to keep playing around the edges and people are going to keep fighting. And we need not just to lower how much cops are in our budget, but replace it with ways of dealing with society in a wholesome manner. Like, I was frustrated with what cities did because of COVID, where they locked everything down instead of getting people who are unemployed or out of school to like hand out masks at the parks, right? We're a society of extremes. And I think that's what we're seeing. Like, the police got to such a point that there's a big pushback from other parts of society. And I'm really interested to see what's going to happen. And I hope that our elected officials wake up.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem too. What you just outlined is that, we've had this tinkering on the edges of dealing with structural racism, whether it's in the police force or any sort of institution in society. And it's allowed some contingent of white people to say that this problem has been dealt with. And clearly what we're seeing now is that if you didn't know it before, you might as well know it now. This shit has not been dealt with. So the problem is that tinkering on the sides for so long from people like Nancy Pelosi and the corporate Democrats and so forth has kind of allowed some contingent of the white Democratic base, and more so the Republican base, to just say outright that the problem's over and that it's solved. And so had we kind of dealt with a real structural analysis about dealing with racism when it comes to providing, reparations and dealing with structural racism inside of the police departments, we could have been on a better trajectory than what we're currently on now, I
think I want to just interject to mention 10forjustice.com is a site that just launched today from friends on the left, and it's abolitionist steps towards getting to no police, right? To getting rid of the carceral system. And when you look at something like, we had that 8 can't wait reform that was being promoted very heavily by Andrew, you're talking about like neoliberal centrists, like people who are reformist. And what really got to me is, I believe that San Francisco has had all 8 for like a long time, and it doesn't solve the problem. They had to, police chief had to resign a few years ago because of an armed man getting shot a ridiculous number of times. And it was, part of a pattern and practice. And when I worked in the city, it was a pattern and practice that police, not all of them, but some of them, and the whole system rewards it, lets them get away with it. And they have all of these things. They have an independent citizen, agency that investigates the police. And meanwhile, the taxpayers pay the lawsuits. The taxpayers pay for these insane salaries for the cops, and Black and brown people suffer, including losing their lives because of the racism in these departments.
If you think about it for a second, these cops received funding from us. These guys were at work basically saying, we're not racist, but calling me the N-word. Meanwhile, they probably think Candace Owens is a good one, and Clarence Thomas is the right guy. So that's probably why they justify whatever that they justify in thinking that they're not racist, and that's problematic in itself. But what's interesting about this particular conversation is that cops across the nation have such an entrenched process that even well-meaning people don't understand how dangerous they are for Black and brown and Native communities, because we have done such a good job, even as centrist Democrats, even as Democrats and on the left, by centering whiteness. If a white woman is scared, it is okay to fund whatever the hell happens, because I'm not concerned about it as long as my wife, when I go home, my wife is happy and she feels safe and secure. And that is finally kind of being realized. The sort of funding the Karens is sort of stopping now, which makes more sense than anything. If 54% of the LA budget is going to policing, then imagine what taking 20% of that would do and putting it into education and putting it into a jobs program. We would see automatic differences in crime levels. We would see automatic differences in levels of bad policing and good conduct and training, and also that's just basic funding of after school programs that have been proven to actually help increase good neighborhoods, and also funding lunches and stuff like that. So we have a budget. We have a budget process that is basically centered on white fragility, and we need to get out of that process.
We have a media process that's also like that too.
Well, guys, hold on. I want to switch. We got to switch gears for a moment because we do have a special guest standing by. Ricarra Jones is the political director for SEIU 1199, representing Maryland and DC. Her union has been engaged in a fight to advance the minimum wage in the state of Maryland, and that fight continues to this day. Ricarra, we appreciate you taking some time to speak with us. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you for having me part of your show this evening.
Listen, bring us up to speed on what's been happening, because we know the push here in the state of Maryland for Fight for 15 is one that is nationwide as well. But as well as in other places, there has been a lot of pushback from the business community, and especially now with COVID exasperating every aspect of inequity in our society. Talk to us about what is the latest that is happening on this front to raise the minimum wage.
So what's happening is, I think, we're all experiencing, the economy is going through a lot of turbulence right now, and there's a high level of unemployment. But unfortunately, when we passed the minimum wage law in Maryland, there was a piece of the legislation that allowed for a one-time freeze, that we could freeze the minimum wage as it continues to go up to $15 an hour, which it'll hit 15 in 2025. And the Board of Public Works has the ability to freeze it based on levels of unemployment. And so recently, a couple of business groups, Chamber of Commerce, the NFIB, they reached out and wrote a letter to the governor and the Board of Public Works and our presiding officers at the Maryland General Assembly, asking that this freeze be, that they initiate the freeze on the minimum wage. So currently the minimum wage is at 11. The next step would take it up about to like 60 to 75 cents. And they're asking that the minimum wage be frozen at $11 an hour. So that's currently where we are. And we've been doing a lot of advocating to try to make sure that, this would be actually the worst time that we could freeze the minimum wage. This is the time that we talk a lot about our healthcare heroes and our folks that are on the front line and essential workers, and how that have helped us make it through this pandemic. They've been the ones making sure that we have our groceries and protecting and caring for our loved ones and nursing home workers. And these are really the folks that have been out there risking their lives and the lives of their families to protect us during this pandemic. And the way that we thank them, we don't think it should be by freezing their wages.
Oh my gosh, you bring up so many excellent points. Of course, the essential workers are the reason why this country is still functioning over the past, 8 to 12 weeks. If it wasn't for people on the front lines, the grocery workers, the sanitation workers, nurses and doctors, et cetera, people out there grinding, keeping this country moving, we would be in far dire straits than what we are currently. Ricarra, tell our audience, who are your members? Who does SEIU 1199 represent?
So we represent nursing home workers and hospital workers across the state of Maryland and DC. We're the largest healthcare union in the country. And during this pandemic and before this pandemic, our members have been frontline essential healthcare workers who've been providing care for folks, in nursing homes and hospitals across the state.
And how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected your members?
I mean, it's been rough. I mean, a lot of them are just as scared and as nervous as all of us were when this first hit. Even though they had jobs in healthcare field, they were also scared. They're also nervous. We've had a number of our folks who have tested positive. We've also lost a few members. And then they've also just dealt with the fact that a lot of our facilities and long-term care facilities, nursing homes and hospitals weren't necessarily prepared. They did not have proper PPE. They did not put proper protocols into place to protect them when they should have, especially in our nursing home workers. The industry was very, very late to put protocols in. For example, still allowing non-essential folks to come into the nursing homes. We had huge issues with lack of testing. Our members were often working with COVID positive patients with COVID-19. Were not informed that they were working with positive patients. Were denied testing. And again, we're just also having huge issues with getting PPE. These issues are still ongoing. There's been times when our members were giving rain ponchos and shower bonnets and to use as PPE in these facilities. And then another issue that I think a lot of people overlook is that, while PPE was provided for doctors and nurses, a lot of times it was denied for the folks that were cleaning the rooms, the folks that were bringing the trays, the dietary folks. And there's huge issues and inequalities with even like how PPE was given out to folks during this pandemic. So, and I think while, there are folks who would like to say that this is over, we're still experiencing large shortages and people are still really struggling with, being able to go to work and be protected. And another major issue they dealt with is that, while people, when they tested positive, we were told to quarantine, right? But a lot of our members and healthcare workers in general, they live in places, maybe bed apartments, and it's difficult to be able to actually truly quarantine. You have to still take care of your kids. You still have to, cook them dinner. You still have to do all of those things. So while some people have the luxury of being able to quarantine, a lot of our members did not have that luxury.
Yeah, I just had a quick question here. Oh, you can go, Marcus.
Yeah, Ricarra, my question is, like, along with all the like the issues of family that your members have to deal with, does this moment actually affect them wanting to go vote? Does this moment affect their families? Do they have the energy? Are they available to actually like do their civic duty and democracy? I mean, have you been seeing an issue with that?
So as an organization, we are very involved in politics and elections. And we just recently were very involved in mayoral election in Baltimore City. And while we typically would have had our members out knocking doors and boots on the ground, we had to quickly change pace and change our program to adapt to the new surroundings. And I'll say I was extremely surprised that while our members were dealing with this pandemic and working multiple shifts and, just mentally not in a place, they still were very, very engaged. They worked very hard. They got on the phone. They made calls. It made them, like, the message that we talked about a lot is like, this really shows how important leadership is. Like if anything hasn't shown you that like who's guiding the ship is important, it's this, because these are the reasons why some of the things that should have been in place are not, because the leaders they're not taking it seriously and they're not making sure that they're leading in a good way. So they were, difficult while it was for them at work, they were still very engaged in this last election. And we know that that's going to continue into the general.
Ricarra, I just had a quick question about, you just talked about guiding the ship and stuff like that. And there's been a lot of media focus on initially of Larry Hogan kind of praising him for like getting all these tests and things like that. And I think it's just kind of really disconnected from reality and how he's dealing with the state and as it relates to, the political pressure that he's facing to kind of reopen the state, obviously. And I'm just curious as to what you and your members think about, his reaction as it relates to like the nursing homes and a lot of the people that you represent, and like what kind of structural analysis, would you give to Hogan?
I mean, I think I'll just say that initially, I think a lot of us were like, oh, he's doing such a great job. And then when you peel back the layers, we were able to see that one, the nursing homes were a hot spot, but we knew they were going to be a hot spot because the issues that made nursing homes a hot spot are issues that we've been dealing with for years, right? Like the staffing issues. If you go into most nursing homes, there's always staffing issues. There are never enough folks in there to take care of the patients that are in there. And now when you have people who are testing positive for COVID-19 and have to be on quarantine, this just makes it, a much bigger issue. And then the fact that we didn't get mandatory testing until it was way too late and too many of our members and staff were exposed is a huge issue. So, we're also very close to AFSCME, who represents the state workers. And it was great to see that, Hogan had put all these things in place for other businesses and totally ignored the needs of the state workers, and is even considering balancing the current budget with layoffs and cuts to staffing to folks in Maryland. So, I think initially, if you on the outset, Hogan was out front, but there was huge issues in his response and in his continued response, because we're reopening way too fast when, like I was saying before, there are still huge issues with just even making sure that the folks who are caring for COVID-19 positive patients are even protected. We're still seeking donations for a PPE. We still don't have enough staff to cover the shifts in nursing homes. So there are still a lot of issues that, we're hoping that would be handled and taken care of before we begin to reopen at such a fast level.
And in the middle of all of this, they're fighting you for 60 to 75 cents an hour for these workers.
It's crazy. It's just like it's while we're on the other end fighting for hazard pay or pandemic pay or crisis pay, whatever you want to call it, it's like at the other end, we're dealing with the fact that, our workers' wages could be frozen, which is difficult where they're figuring out how are they going to still pay their rent? How are they going to still pay, all of these things that eventually there have been, we've been able to get some holds on them. But, next month rent is going to be due. Mortgage is going to be due. So it's just very frustrating, one, that this is a fight that we're still continuing to have. And for the folks that we know, like we knew these workers were essential before we started calling them essential workers, right? But we've constantly had people fighting us on that level. But we need to definitely continue to raise wages for these folks that are on the front line and in doing this work on a regular basis, who, by the way, are mostly women and women of color.
Do you think most of the pushback comes from this idea that it could affect small businesses? Because I've been doing a lot of research on, this Republican line that they always push about small businesses. But in actuality, it's a rhetorical reaction tactic in order to take the onus away from actually paying people a livable wage. And so I'm just curious as to what the line has been and what the suppression has been of your movement for your workers from, people in power like Hogan as it relates to this issue of how it would affect small businesses.
Yeah, I mean, that's the argument we hear the most. It's also the one that has zero proof, because when you look at the numbers, it's small businesses normally pay above the minimum wage. They normally offer the best benefits because they know they need to keep good people in order to keep their business running smoothly. It's the big box corporations that are paying the poverty wages, right? It's the Walmarts. It's the folks like that are paying folks not enough money, so they're relying on public assistance, and then we all have to shoulder and the burden and the cost of that. So, but on the other end, I do certainly understand that it's been tough on all of us, right? So small businesses, workers alike, but we just have to make sure that we are not going to balance our budget. We're not, going to do that on the backs of the very workers who have been the ones, making sure that we're moving forward, as we move through this pandemic. And we also have, and even just recently, we just did a rally last week, and we had a number of small businesses who are, having a difficult time, who are still like, you know what, we need to keep the minimum wage moving, because they know the more people make, the more they spend.
Ricarra, you mentioned that your members were having a lot of difficulties accumulating PPE in inadequate amounts. All the public health officials, Center for Disease Control, state health officials say that we are, without question, headed towards a second wave come this fall, and most definitely in the winter. What steps are being taken, to your knowledge, by these nursing homes and by the state to ensure that people working in these facilities will continue to be protected, or be offered at least better protection than they were at the onset at the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, we're in constant communication with the state, and encouraging our facilities to, one, make sure that they are monitoring the amount of PPE that they have now. And we've also, as an organization, we've tried to connect them with folks that they can purchase PPE from. We've made sure that we've gotten donations of PPE so that they can try to make sure that their levels are high. But we've just been having the conversations that, this is something that we need to make sure that we're paying attention to. And that they are constantly looking at, what they have on hand, because we know that this is not going to be short-lived, and that they need to do a much better job of supplying PPE. Like, we have a number of members who are giving gowns that they're constantly being asked to reuse. They're giving face shields. They're being asked to take them home and wash them. So this is, I think sometimes the media or maybe the state would have us believe that we've reached a good place, but this is, it's just not accurate. And we don't have the levels of PPE that we need currently. So, it's definitely, it's a huge issue that we are, as an organization, trying to stay on top of, and encourage them to definitely think about where we can get a better supply of currently like what we have.
And lastly, Ricarra, I wanted to ask you, without question, people who work in the nursing homes are frontline workers. They are essential workers. They're taking care of our parents and our grandparents, and they're doing extremely important work for our society. Who do we need to talk to get these people more money? Is it Hogan? Is it the people that own the nursing homes? Because we need to run these people their coin for real. And as you said, they were essential workers before they were even deemed to be essential workers. So what needs to happen to get these folks more cash, more money, more salary, more income?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are some state-run facilities, and it's one of the main reasons that we, played a huge role and led the Fight for 15 effort. It's because of the backbreaking long hours and the work that our members were doing. Most nursing home workers, they don't just work, they work at multiple locations. They work multiple shifts. So it's just something I think that we have to keep, on the forefront, and keep talking about how important it is. And, and when we talk about essential workers, let's just not talk about, let's praise them and take pictures and do flyovers and, clap for them. But we have to talk about their wages, and we have to talk about how much they make, and that it's not right that we have healthcare workers who work in healthcare facilities that share medication because they can't afford to purchase their own medication, right? Or they can't, when they retire, they work until they're 75, 80 years old because they can't afford to retire. They don't have pensions. So, I mean, it's a much larger conversation. And, we're constantly having this conversation, not only at the state level, but also on the federal level, and just talking about how, we need to care for the folks that care for our loved ones and our families, and make sure they can support and care for themselves.
All right. Well, we're gonna leave it there. We hear the pup. The pup has some things to say in the background. Also, Ricarra Jones, thank you so much. She is the political director for Maryland in DC for SEIU 1199, or 1199 SEIU. I think is how is the order that they say it. And Ricarra, thank you so much. Panel, thank y'all again. Andrew Corkery, Adriel Hampton, Marcus Ferrell. We appreciate y'all stopping by and engaging in some conversation here at The Real News on Stir Crazy. Thank y'all, gentlemen. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Gang, don't forget, tomorrow is First Nation Fridays. We are going to be joined here again with Jen Deerenwater, Desiree Kane, Johnny J. We're going to be discussing a range of issues across Indian country. Even if you are not indigenous, it's really important that you tune in and get an idea about what is happening currently in Indian country, because quite frankly, you live in Indian country, damn it. Like where you live got colonized from Indian country into whatever state that you reside in. So technically you live in Indian country too. So you should want to tune into that. And don't forget also tonight here on our YouTube channel, the premiere of the latest episode of the Police Accountability Report. You know, Stephen Janis and Taya Graham do fantastic, amazing reporting, keeping police accountable and bringing stories directly to you. So thank you all again for rocking with us here on Stir Crazy. I'm Kim Brown. Hasta mañana. Deuces.